very fun panel. I think.
Welcome back, everybody. We will start with panel 2 now, Impact of Peace and Conflict on Food Security. The panel is chaired by Dr. Luis Arimatsu, a distinguished policy fellow at the LSE WPS Centre. And I would now like to invite them to start their panel.
So, okay, thank you so much, and welcome to this second session, the impact of peace and conflict on food security. My name is Louise Arimatsu, and I'm a visiting fellow with the Centre for Women, Peace and Security. Now, this session will last for about an hour. Panelists will present for about 40 minutes in total, leaving the rest of the time for Q&As and discussion. And if anyone would like to tweet about the conference, and unlike me, they have connection, you can use the hashtag LSE IWD conference. Okay, so in reflecting on the comments and presentations made in the earlier sessions today, women's contribution to global food production is clearly enormous. The UN has estimated that women are responsible for cultivating more than 50% of the world's food, yet their critical role in promoting food security from the local to the global is often undervalued. Notwithstanding their contribution, women remain disproportionately affected by malnutrition and food insecurity, largely due to pre-existing gender inequalities, social, cultural, economic, political, and legal, which are often intersectional and serve as obstacles to women's empowerment and self-determination, including in the field of agriculture. In times of crisis, these obstacles are magnified. War typically disrupts livelihoods, resulting in economic hardship and food insecurity for local populations, while the disruption to existing food production systems can sometimes have cascading global implications, as per Ukraine. The effects of armed hostilities between warring parties often leave local agricultural ecologies damaged and/or destroyed, as per Palestine, with adverse short- and long-term consequences that can disproportionately impact women. Now, states have a responsibility to mitigate these adverse effects and to address all forms of discrimination, including gender. But too often, states do too little or nothing, and in some cases adopt gender-blind policies that create new or cement existing obstacles that function to disempower. Cash transfer programs are obviously one type of intervention that can help to mitigate food insecurity. But do states pay adequate attention to the gendered consequences of such measures? It is within this context that it's my privilege to introduce my first speaker to my left, Professor Reem Ayadi, who will be elaborating on the gendered dimensions of the economic consequences of conflict on food security and the role of cash transfer programs to tackle the problem. Reem is an economist and a leading expert on inclusive and sustainable social economic models, international financial systems, sustainable finance, and social and economic development and foresight in economies in transition. She is a founder and president of the Euro-Mediterranean Economists Association, a Barcelona-based regional think tank. She is co-founder of the Brain Capital Alliance and founder of the director of the Euro-Mediterranean and African Network for Economic Studies. Reem is also professor at the Bayes Business School and City University of London and senior advisor at the Centre for European Policy Studies. So over to you, Reem.
Good morning, everybody. It's a real pleasure and honor to be today with all of you. Thank you, Louise. Thank you, Haifa, for inviting me to this very important event. And I wouldn't even see it as only an event. It's really a responsibility to take actions. I think, first of all, I congratulate all of you for the Women's Day, or me also part of it. So I congratulate us, and I think our role is very important to bring some key aspects and themes to the forefront and act on them. So the topic today is really important because empowering women, and we are in 2025, it's a key element and we need to act upon it. If we take the case, for example, in Africa and in the Arab world, there is a lot to do, and we are still talking about the empowerment, we are still talking about how can women really be the lever, the motor of our economic development, and how we can really go beyond those economic disruptions that we are living nowadays. I think our economies globally are suffering from conflicts, from climate crisis, from a surge of conservatism, and also the surge of extremism. And I think this is very, I would say, dangerous for our social progress and economic development. And without economic development, in my view, there is no social progress, and without social progress, there is no economic development. So again, my talk today, and as you mentioned, Louise, I would like to focus on this gender dimension of the economic consequences of conflicts. Nowadays, there is a surge of conflicts everywhere in the world. I mean, of course, Africa, it's the center, but also the Middle East, also Europe. I was 1 week in Brussels, and it's all about conflict. It's all about putting money or investing money into defense policy, into arms, and this is not good news for anybody. Of course, we need security policy, but again, I think we need to also think about real economic development within the arm of prosperity and peace, and this is what we would like to see. Conflicts, they not only disrupt the value chains overall in agriculture and food, but also the vulnerable populations, which are women and other vulnerable populations, like, for example, aging people and also youth. They are the first one to be impacted by these disruptions. And obviously, if we look at the conflicts, we see a lot of destruction over there. And of course, with economic disruptions, the cost on all the aspects of the food chain and the food security, food value chain and food security will go up. And this we've seen it, for example, with the increase of food prices over the last years. So then, if we take the case in Africa, where the majority of the women make, or practically, as we mentioned, 50% of Africa agriculture workforce, the conflict often displaces female farmers, forcing them to abandon their farms and then livestock. But then at the same time in Africa, which is very interesting, there is a disconnect between the ownership of the lands and also the use of the lands. And sometimes when there is no conflict, the situation of the women is very complex because they have certain agreement with certain players over there, the chiefs, for example, of the lands or so on. And sometimes it's very complex the way they are doing business. For example, I've seen this in the specific case of Ghana, where the connection between the land ownership and the land use is not so obvious, and it makes it extremely hard for women to produce. And this is also a male-dominated, I would say, sector sometimes. So, in fact, when there is a conflict, there is also the loss of access to lands and input and capital, and the women, they get much more struggles really to ensure that they keep this livelihood and they can keep their caregiving role within their families, and also it gets into all these negative, destructive dynamics where there is only economic destruction. And nowadays, it's very difficult even to see what is the impact, the monetary impact of this destruction. And this is quite important to, in reality, look at it and see what is the cost for the economies in Africa. So beyond this, of course, there is the unpaid labor burden. The majority, sometimes they do not get paid, and sometimes are within the informal economy. Of course, the informal economy, it can be a social valve for certain sectors and for certain regions, but then at the same time, it does not allow women to have social protection. So if there is a conflict, there is no way that there is a social protection, a safety net, which allow women to continue their role within the production in the farm or in the distribution and in the overall connection with the livelihood. And it becomes completely difficult because we are entering into a very difficult dynamic. So again, there is a role for the state, there is a role for the government, but then if the norms and the the informal institutions are not really pushing for much more empowerment and legal rights, the legal rights is so important. Of course, I'm an economist and I'm from Tunisia originally, and the first thing is the social right for women to have the right to ownership, to have the right to go to the bank and get a loan, to get also to be part of the economic fabric, and this is first step. Then, of course, when there is a conflict, they are recognized as a pillar for economic construction, and also later on after the conflict, we've seen in many cases where there is reconstruction, women are not even part of it. So it's mainly male-oriented type of reconstruction policies where there is no this gender-sensitive dimension where it brings the safety net, social protection when there is, and again, another conflict, because the conflict doesn't come and go. I mean, it continues, it's recurring. And nowadays, in my view, beyond the conflict, there is also the climate change, and this is a much bigger risk for displacement, for food insecurity, and the cost will be much, much higher than what we would expect. I've seen some assessments where practically we are losing not only economic value, but also we are losing human value, and this is what is very, very, very dangerous. Now, another aspect, which is the price. Of course, the food prices are going up, and as I mentioned, the conflict they disrupt. So you don't know if there is a possibility to have those. I mean, there is no, I would say again, insurance for a sudden increase of food prices. In Europe, for example, there is. I mean, there are subsidies. But then in Africa, there is no subsidies in that sense. So then the governments in Africa, they are not really taking the roles they should take because of the overall generalized conflict. And then, of course, you all know what are the consequences of this. And then, obviously, if we think about from an economic perspective for the sector, for the women themselves, there is a loss of mental health for these women. There is also the link with their children, because they are normally taking care of the children, and if there is a lack of food, there is malnutrition, there is also all type of, I would call the perverse deepening of the cycle of poverty and inequality. The last point I want to say here in terms of these disruptions are the reduced access to education and to skills, because of course if there is the minimum function, which is the basic function of food security, is not fulfilled, then of course many others, the negative cycle will continue, and this only brings this destruction. So what should be done? I think, of course, the international community has been quite active in many aspects. Nowadays, we need to move beyond the aid policy, and there is a movement, a move into the other direction. But how do we fill the gap? I think I wanted to talk about the cash transfers from the governments themselves to the women who are affected by these conflicts, particularly the small-scale farmers. Of course, these cash transfers, they have to benefit very much from the digital technologies. Nowadays, there are several cases, for example, in Kenya, the M-Pesa case, for example, or many other cases using the blockchain technologies, where you can really design solutions for specific gender-targeted cash transfers. But beyond this, and I want to add, finish with this, Louise, is in Africa, it's a resource-endowed continent. But then, unfortunately, the minerals and resources are not necessarily well managed and well designed for the social progress and for the economic development. But then one aspect which I worked on many years ago was mining, small-scale mining for women, and there is a connection there with agriculture. So if, for example, certain governments allow women to start really learning this mining for livelihood and then transform this model into agriculture fields and really developing this connection, this could be very empowering for women and also for the countries themselves in terms of economic development. And again, there is a need to globally to deal with those conflicts, and I think hopefully we move into that direction. But nowadays, I think I am not very optimistic about it. I'll stop here.
Thank you very much, Rim. So many issues that you raise here, and the complexity and interlinkages that I think our audience is going to want to come back to you with lots of questions. So I want to introduce my second speaker, who is Charlotte Brand, who actually picks up on the topic of cash assistance in the context of her field work in Uganda. Charlotte's research brings to the surface the lived experiences of women who have been forcibly displaced and their struggle to overcome food insecurity. Charlotte is based in the Department for International Development here at the LSE. Her most recent research has been to critically examine the humanitarian and policy implications and gendered effects of Uganda's food and cash assistance prioritization strategy that has now been implemented in some of its refugee settlements. Charlotte's research findings are important because they are relevant to refugee hosting countries in and beyond East Africa. So I'm now going to invite Charlotte to share her findings and thoughts in this context. Thank you.
Thank you. Hi everyone, happy International Women's Day. I just, before I start properly, I just want to acknowledge that a lot of the conflict contexts we're talking about are very heavy and talking about situations where people are very disempowered. And I just don't want that. What I want you to hear from some of these stories is that people are making huge efforts to cater for themselves, their families, and really working hard on that. And it's the structural barriers that are in place that are the problem here. So I just don't want to neglect people's agency and all of these things whilst we're having these discussions. So thank you very much to the organisers, to my co-panellists and everyone who's spoken already. It's been really interesting. So my perspective is very much more in the kind of everyday workings of how humanitarian policies and these sort of structural constraints impact people's efforts to build out their household food security. So I'm talking about Uganda and particularly South Sudanese refugees who are living in Uganda. The reason I think Uganda is such an interesting case in this context is because it's got this very, for those who work in the refugee space, maybe famous refugee policy. They host 1.7 million refugees. 78% of that population are women and children. So it's very relevant to what we're talking about here. And the main kind of backbone of the humanitarian architecture in Uganda is essentially subsistence farming and kind of agricultural interventions. So what I want, I guess, to contribute here in particular is, one, thinking more critically about the kind of timeframes we talk about displacement and rebuilding and these kind of consequences of conflict, and also thinking about the real nuances that we've already heard a little bit about of how this plays out unevenly, not just across communities, but within households. with really huge effects. So to kind of give a quick overview of the Ugandan refugee framework, which is really celebrated as like a global model and a kind of the way to do things. Each refugee household is given a plot of land within settlements. So these settlements are sort of integrated with Ugandan communities. The people have the right to freedom of movement, the right to work, and the right to access a lot of public health services on equal basis with Ugandan citizens. Unfortunately, this infrastructure is hugely strained, underfunded, people are placed in very, very rural settings where markets are very underdeveloped, so the actual kind of access to working opportunities is very, very limited. And at the same time, so the land that they are allocated is often the least fertile land. It's often not actually going to be able to cater for the refugee household, which it can include up to 16 members on a plot of, and this is an average, this is not what everyone gets, 30 by 30 metres. And that's got to include their house, their latrine, and every kind of function that the house needs to fulfil needs to happen within that space. So the idea behind Uganda's refugee policy is to enable people to be self-reliant within quite a short time frame. Now the reality of this, when you can't grow crops effectively, despite your best efforts, when there's not necessarily a market to sell your things to, or to kind of explore other opportunities, is really very difficult. After 6 months of being in Uganda as a refugee, the age you're given on a monthly basis really drops off quite sharply. The current statistics are that more than 80% of the refugee population gets what is equivalent to 13 cents, as in like USD cents, a day per household member. Now, I don't think there's much you can do with that amount of money. That's $3.7 over the month. So what you find is that households are enormously food insecure. There's sort of 90+% of the refugee households in Uganda are highly economically vulnerable, and this pushes people into really, really difficult situations. So in the case of South Sudan, return is not really an option. It's especially even in the last few days, it seems increasingly unstable. And so even though people have been displaced for years, this doesn't look like it's changing. You've got really high dependency ratios, and so there's often one, maybe two adults who are catering for a number of children, and so they seek out precarious labour options, often on locally held Ugandan land. Now, I don't want to give the impression that Ugandans are necessarily profiting from this, because actually they're often impoverished as well. But basically the refugee population ends up being a supply of very, very cheap, poorly paid labour. They have to walk hours to do this work. It's very, very hard agricultural work. And essentially what ends up happening is you get household desertification, you get what are effectively end up being child-headed households, because the wage labourer is out looking for some way to feed their families. And all of the social consequences that we're being picked up on that come with that. The thing, I guess, that I really want to pull out here is that when households are food insecure, in terms of what this means for women, what the research, so myself and a colleague have been working on this with South Sudanese researchers and with Ugandan researchers, and what we find consistently is that oftentimes women, I think it was mentioned earlier, they eat last and they eat less. Now that's obviously not universally true, but in a lot of cases, pregnant and lactating mothers will redistribute the food within the household to go towards the children. Obviously, when they are either growing a child or, feeding a young baby, and they're not nourished themselves, that has huge implications also on the child's health. And so there's this knock-on effect that has a long-term impact on the development of children as well as obviously the sacrifices that the women are making in these settings. Now, I guess the thing that strikes me here is when everyone is talking about cuts to aid, USAID, governments rolling back what they offer in circumstances of displacement, is that these kind of real lived effects are they're completely lost in all of these stories, and this has huge economic consequences, huge social ramifications, makes the process of rebuilding really difficult. It weakens Ugandan economic prosperity and all of these aspects, because people are the ones living the consequences of this. And so what I want to draw out is, when we're talking about agricultural productivity and production, all of these things, we also have to confront the reality that a lot of people simply don't have access to land in order to sort of even access these opportunities, which are also, then imperfect, right? And I think that's what kind of comes out of some of this work, particularly for displaced populations. And the other thing is that when people complain about the lack of food or the lack of opportunities to grow their own food, they are often violently repressed, right? Just in the last week, there was an incident in Kakuma refugee camp in Kenya, where the refugee population and local population were basically protesting the withdrawal of food aid. Kakuma is kind of famous for not really giving refugees any opportunity other than be dependent on what they're given. And they were tear gas, and hit with bullets and all of these things, right? And so just the mere expression of "I'm hungry" is seen as an affront to governments worldwide. And one of the things that has really stuck with me is, one of the things that kept coming up in the research was this phrase that you can dodge bullets, but you can't dodge hunger. And I still haven't managed to fully unpack that, but it was a common kind of phrase that was circulating among refugees, and I just think it's really points to the effect of food insecurity on every aspect of social life, personal well-being, health outcomes, and so I'm going to finish there. Thank you.
Thank you, Charlotte. So much to come back to you on. I've got questions, and I'm sure, and I've noted that my panelists have also jotted down questions that I might take the liberty of coming back to you and having a conversation amongst the panelists before we open it up to the floor. So my third speaker is Dr. Dina Zayed, who is a policy strategist and independent researcher. Dina's expertise straddles climate adaptation, politics and finance, international development, social and climate justice, and public participation in climate governance. Now, in addition to being Programme Director with the Climate Emergency Collaboration Group, Dina has worked on a range of commissioned projects and collaborated with a host of organisations, including ODI Global, UN Women, and the International Development Research Centre. Now, if Charlotte's research invites us to engage with the particular, Dina's work invites us to step back and to critically think about the interlinkages between conflict, climate, gender, and debt, and the implications for food security at regional and global levels. Dina's commitment to interdisciplinary problem solving places her at the forefront of an intellectual shift to think across traditional boundaries. So with that, can I ask you to share some of your views with the audience?
Thank you. Thank you, Louise. And thank you for a very large introduction suggesting I have interdisciplinary solutions, which I'm not sure I do. But this is, thank you again to LSE and to co-panelists for this wonderful and happy opportunity to actually think about the relationship between conflict, food security, and gender. And as Louise has mentioned, I'm going to focus my contribution today on thinking about the intersection between fragility, food, climate change, and debt. Now, you'll see that we're playing a little bit with scale across the different speakers. And I'm going to start by saying for the last few months, I have been thinking about the unprecedented global debt pictures as part of a role supporting the independent expert review on debt, nature, and climate. As Charlotte has also just referenced, and as many colleagues in the room would know, we are watching an aid landscape face an unprecedented existential shock to its core. And some of you may also know that 2025 is going to be an important year for conversations on the future of financing the Sustainable Development Goals. We're gathered here just a few days before the Development Cooperation Summit on the road to the 4th International Conflict on Financing for Development that will be in Spain this year. Now, I'm starting at this macro global scale, and if you'll bear with me for a reason. We know from the World Bank's latest international debt report that developing countries have spent a record $1.4 trillion to service foreign debts as interest rates climbed to a 20-year high in 2023. For some of the poorest and most vulnerable countries, many of them on the African continent, a record $96.2 billion were spent on servicing debt in 2023. This is a global picture in which the world's poorest countries are slashing expenditure on health, education, and social services to be able to pay and meet the services for these record levels of public debt. At least 3.3 billion people live in countries that spend more on interest rates than investing in health and education combined. In Africa, these unmet climate finance needs are roughly the same amount as external debt services. Now, in parallel and building on what Charlotte has shared, we also know that the world is witnessing an unprecedented displacement crisis with over 82 million people forcibly displaced from their homes. Last year, we hit 2 new and perhaps interlinked milestones. 2024 saw the highest number of armed conflicts in a single year since the Second World War. And 2024 also saw this was the same year that we officially exceeded 1.5 degrees Celsius. We also witnessed catastrophic levels of hunger that have nearly doubled, in large part because of the devastating situations in both Gaza and Sudan, and again, Louise has mentioned some of this at the start. Now, if you'll be patient with me for a little bit longer, I'd like to point your attention to 2 other figures to reflect on. Development Finance International and Oxfam found in their 5th edition of the Commitment to Reducing Inequality Index that 4 in 5 countries have cut the share of their budgets going to education, health, and/or social protection because of a combination of debt, austerity, and conflict. 4 in 5 countries have backtracked on progressive taxation, and 9 in 10 have regressed on labor rights and minimum wages. Now, another figure to hold in mind is one that is produced by the SDG Gender Index that also tells us that more than 850 million women and girls are now living in countries that are rated as very poor for gender equality. We are at a moment in time where we are seeing what appears to be unambiguous and synchronized backtracking and backlash on gender rights. And we're gathered here on International Women's Day, and the reason I started off with this laundry list of trigger warnings is to say that for many of us, if we're going to seriously center a feminist ethic of analyzing the state of affairs in the world and a feminist commitment to changing it, is to begin from a point of recognition that the lives and fate of women are fundamentally bound up in a global story of multiple intersecting and interdependent crises. It feels like a truism at this point, and especially within the context of today's discussion, to say that we know without any doubt that the impacts of climate change are not gender neutral. We also know through decades of research that the costs of macroeconomic debt are often passed down to households, and women and girls end up being triply disadvantaged because they're the first to lose access to public services, they're the first to lose access to frontline public jobs, and the first to take on the burdens of unpaid care when ultimately public services are no longer able to do so. Feminist scholarship and activism, as Laurie Zoleth puts it, requires paying attention not just to the specifics of the embodied plight of women at the margins, but also to the systemic issues and power that creates structural and organizational relationships of oppression. We see incredible advances in both academia and practice in developing a greater understanding of how systemic issues combine and feedback off one another. And we know, for instance, from the likes of the International Panel of Experts on Sustainable Food Systems, that today's unsustainable and inequitable global food systems are often a key contributor to debt crisis. We also have an important and growing recognition on the relationship between conflict and climate change, and especially how that plays out in shaping our diets and supply chains. We know that there is a relationship between conflict and debt, and the idea, as Rim has shared, that violent conflict reduces economic output is uncontroversial. On average, over the past half-century, armed conflict has been associated with slowing growth and rising public debt. And if I use another example specifically from the economies of the Middle East and Central Asia that have been most affected by conflicts, and should also note that this is a region that hosts the highest share of internally displaced populations and refugees anywhere in the world, that even a decade after a severe conflict, their income per capita remains about 10% lower. But how much of our research and policy agenda is geared towards a feminist theorization of these interlinkages, and how much do we understand about the role that gender rights, equity, and importantly, resistance plays in shaping the trajectories of how we begin to imagine addressing intersecting, interdependent, and interconnected crises. I come from Egypt, a country that is the world's largest wheat importer and is today the IMF's third largest debtor. And I would like to brief a little bit on Egypt, the example of Egypt, to ask these questions. Between 2010 and 2023, Egypt's external debt jumped from $36.8 billion to $168.1 billion. Now, this is a country that has long-standing macroeconomic vulnerabilities and is barely recovering from political upheaval in 2011 and 2013, and has had to face repeat external shocks, the latest of which include the Gaza devastation and the war in Ukraine. Ukrainian wheat made up nearly 30% of Egypt's supply, and every one of Egypt's borders is affected by protracted or intensifying conflict. And this is a country that imports about 40% of its food. With austerity measures as part of Egypt's IMF conditions, and all of these factors working together, Egypt had the fifth highest inflation rate for food in 2023 at 56.3%. And nearly a third of the citizens of Africa's third most populated country experienced severe to moderate food insecurity between 2020 and 2022. And what's happening in the agricultural sector? And again, as we discussed this morning, like many countries in the world, we're seeing a feminization of the agricultural labor force, and most women working in agriculture in Egypt are unpaid. Pushing on to 50% of women agricultural workers in Egypt are working on family-owned farms. These unpaid laborers have no access to social protection or health insurance. They're often performing this unpaid labor next to their domestic care duties. And we know that Egypt for decades has been pushed down a path of prioritizing export markets, coupling of a privatization of land, state commodification, and capital-intensive shifts towards agricultural exports, primarily to European markets. I'd invite you to go to any Tesco's or Sainsbury's. You'll find most strawberries and green beans happen to be Egyptian. Those strawberries and those green beans are not produced for the local food market in Egypt. Now, all this means that the food self-sufficiency has been traded off by a logic of a country that desperately needs hard currency to pay and service its foreign debt. Combining with these conditions is a seismic increase in orders and magnitudes of extreme weather events, renewed pressure on water resources, shrinking arable land, and the salinization of soil. The Nile Delta is one of the world's most vulnerable deltas to climate change, and this is a country that has on average seen its rainfall decline by 22% in the last 2 decades, and which may be the second most exposed country in the world in terms of coastal populations affected, and a third in terms of the proportion of its gross domestic product at risk under a 1-meter sea level rise scenario. And we've seen just in the last 5 years agricultural shocks because of extreme weather events. For example, in 2021, heat waves hit the mango crop in Ismailia and the olive crop in Marsa Matruh, the new valley in the western desert. And this resulted in farmers losing up to 80% of their annual harvests. We know that these kinds of shocks have implications for food security, livelihoods, and even identity, and they often drive farmers into household debt as they are forced to pay for fodder, water, and to cover their losses. But what happens to women when these shocks occur, when they don't have ownership over the land and they don't have the legal status to protect their livelihoods as informal workers without paperwork of any capacity to insure themselves against these crop failures? We also have a rich global literature on aggregate household labor responses to climate shocks, but we know a lot less about the individual and the gender-differentiated responses to these shocks. We do know that women are generally less mobile, less likely to find alternative sources of work, and I realize that there are problematizations to this in the literature and many other examples of alternatives. But in the context that I'm speaking of, they are less likely to migrate and tend to be vulnerable and exposed to secondary climate shocks. If we go back to the case of Egypt, and we ask ourselves this question in a period in which we have seen debt rates surge, where and how has Egypt's national climate change strategy and its gender action plan addressed these intersections and addressed the political nature of these gender distinctions? Gender differences are acknowledged but not unpacked in national documents. The gender strategy has practically no mention of Egypt's place in a global food system or supply chain, nor about its vulnerability of the food sector in relationship to Egypt's debt story. And even though the agricultural sector is increasingly feminized, if you explore Egypt's national agricultural adaptation strategy, you'll see that women are touched upon as simple objects of development support, rather than perceived as a political agent to understand how patriarchal systems of inequality intersect to shape the particular set of vulnerabilities and adaptive solutions that are available to us. Now, I started off today by saying we're just a few days away from a key global summit addressing the future of financing development. And I'd like to urge you all to read this global draft document that is currently under negotiation. And you will see that just like Egypt's national documents, that gender is mentioned on a few occasions, often treated like a standalone objective. Agriculture is mentioned in highly technocratic ways, and conflict is mentioned exactly twice as a broad statement indicating that conflict and post-conflict countries have distinct and severe financing needs. Food is mentioned as a crisis of agri-systems and trade, but none of these things are explored as they relate to one another and help reproduce each other. And my message here today is if we are going to get serious about talking about climate change in ways that center power and feminist decolonial approaches, we need to break out of these silos and think about the matrix of relationships that inform adaptive capacities across regions, countries, households, and individuals. We also need to understand how different scales interact. There is nothing ontological about vulnerability, and pre-existing equities that deepen how the climate crisis is felt need to be placed within a political economic reading that allows us to value the lives and work of women differently. We cannot tackle climate change without tackling gender inequality, and we certainly cannot talk about both without addressing unsustainable levels of debt. Equally, we can't tackle the debt crisis if we don't challenge inequitable global food systems. I'd like to close by quoting Rebecca Elliott and her work on the sociology of loss to say that the impacts of climate change are not deterministic, and the work of individuals, groups, communities, and institutions shapes the course of loss, the way it is experienced, when it is experienced, and by whom. When we add a rights framing to the structural stories, we are left with a clear but urgent message that we need to concertedly and seriously ensure that we think about how systems interact and how to move our policy imaginaries forward in a way that recognizes that the right to gender equity, to decent livelihoods, to climate resilient development, and to healthy food are all connected. We must pursue evidence and the production of knowledge that unpacks these connections and brings them to local and global policy conversations, not as an afterthought, but as an intentional commitment to a gender and climate just future. Thank you.
Thank you, Gina. Wow. Okay, so before I bring in the audience, would you like to pose questions or comments in respect of each other's presentations at this stage? Because what a rich body of thought that that's been articulated now. And Reem, I could see you nodding and, any kind of comment back to either Charlotte or Dina? Or
I think Dina mentioned something really important. We need to break the silos. I think this is clear. And there is a clear connection between indebtedness, food security or insecurity, economic creation or destruction. And I think this is also the role, there is also a role of policies on this at the global, regional and local level. The problem I see from this approach is sometimes we lose track of the local components, and also economists in general, they lose that local dimension, and in reality, the suffering and the destruction comes at the local dimension. And you mentioned the refugee camps. I mean, I didn't want to go into those details, but I practically surveyed a lot of cases where in those displacement camps and refugee camps, a lot of violence, gender-based violence, mainly for food, for food issues practically, because they have lack of food. And I didn't even talk about the quality of food, because sometimes also the quality of food is so important for nutrition. I mean, there is a difference between, hunger and nutrition. Sometimes you could be fed with food that is not, that doesn't have the nutrients to be healthy, particularly, for example, in terms of mental health, in terms of overall health. And you mentioned all these components, Dina, but you didn't mention one key element is the health. I mean, and the health is central, because you see, the mother health, the women health is the mother health, is the kids' health, is the next future generations' health. And this is all essential, because of course we talk about a youth continent that is Africa, but then what is the health component connected to that? And nowadays, of course, we talk about conflict, but then we should not lose sight that we are moving into a future where climate change is imposing to us complete different risk scenarios. And those risk scenarios cannot be overcome without increasing indebtedness. So we are entering into this loop of increasing indebtedness, at the same time a risk of overall food insecurity because of the global warming, unless we are going to create something really technologically very interesting, which I don't imagine yet because we need water. And then at the same time, if we see waves of displacements, and then the weaker link is the women in this case, so what is the future generation would look like?
So it seems I was going to say, it seems to me that all three of you provide different critiques, analyses. We actually also, as people call it, feminist women, can identify solutions. We know what the problem is. We critique it. We analyze it. We offer solutions, but that's where it stops. We offer solutions. So how do we get the solutions that we might offer into that mainstream, so we become part of that mainstream? Or does in coming into the mainstream, being part of the mainstream, risk losing the cutting edge analysis that we do because we are located almost on the outside looking into the problem? But anyway, would anyone from the audience at this point like to jump in and sort of offer comments and or questions to any of our panelists? As I said, we've had quite a rich exchange of ideas here. Anyone from the audience? I was going to say you're all dumbstruck. I am too. They were wow. Okay. Would you?
No, I was pointing at somebody down there.
Oh, okay. I thought it was your colleague wanted to come in there. Yeah, I think. Yeah.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Aurelie Walker. I'm an agricultural development economist, and I've specialized in international trade. And after 10 years of feeling like I was banging my head against a brick wall and writing the same articles every time for each WTO ministerial meeting, I switched my focus towards food security. And after spending 4 years based between Jordan and Lebanon, I specialized in the region there, in the Syria sub-region. And I think I have a couple of observations and questions. I think obviously the devastating effects of the conflict on women in the region is real, but there's also another aspect about this creative destruction, which has provided opportunities for change. So, for example, when we looked at the agricultural centrally planned system in Syria, the women were forced to work hard labor in fields, which wasn't work that they would naturally choose. But with the conflict, they were no longer had to work in these roles, and they didn't have a choice as such, but they were automatically released from this type of labor. And when we were looking at, food security for these women, what we found was that, it had to be local solutions, and often the solutions came as a collaboration between the private sector, which naturally overcame some climate problems. So, for example, because they couldn't leave the home and there wasn't and they couldn't access the land, glass houses, hydroponics became really innovative solutions to their challenges, which have overcome conflict and climate challenges at the same time. So I think there's and if we're looking at the context of the changed aid landscape, which we're working in now, I think innovation and working with the private sector is really key to sustainable women's economic empowerment and food security into the future. So perhaps I could ask you, in your work, about innovations that you've seen. I mean, we were talking about linking the policy and practice and research. And then I'd also like to talk to the point about cash transfers. Cash transfers without markets are, not useful, essentially. And perhaps you could talk a little bit to the point about, especially in this new aid landscape, what is the model you foresee for agencies and communities to work between that cash market nexus? Thank you.
Charlotte, would you like to respond first?
Yeah.
Or have I put you on the spot?
No, that's perfect. I just want to make sure I get everything, because there was a lot in that.
Yeah.
Okay. So, on the cash transfers point, cash is cheaper to provide and gives people much more control over what they spend it on. And so Uganda has recently, or is in the process of transitioning to only cash transfers to refugees rather than in-kind food aid. There are some exceptions, but more or less. Obviously I agree that cash without markets is hugely limiting. That being said, I think you'd be hard-pressed to find somewhere where you can't spend at least 13 cents a day, either on school fees or medical treatments or something. That there are things that demand cash. In terms of the private sector integration, so obviously the aid funding situation is pretty bleak and dire and also is really hugely problematic in its own sense. So I don't think that's a solution, but I'm also very, very wary and cautious of private sector involvement. I think fertilizers was one of the things that was mentioned earlier as a way to boost agricultural productivity. In a lot of cases, you see fertilizers that are, extracted in really, really intensive ways. So the kind of source locations have problems, land collapse, various issues. I think phosphorus is one of the world's resources that is really rapidly depleting, which will have huge implications for growing things. And the fertilizers themselves, when they're applied to the land, often like really intensify what is essentially agricultural extraction, right? And so the ecosystems are then really unsettled. And I know there are people in the room who could speak to this much better, but that kind of multi-species lens as well, when we think about kind of the ecology of a place, and these external interventions are sometimes kind of created again as if this is sort of just an experiment, right, in a siloed space, and doesn't think about these kind of interlinkages at this everyday level, which is again why listening to people and their kind of experiences and kind of understanding the places that we're proposing solutions for, we need to center people's own voices and their knowledge, right? So I think absolutely private sector involvement could work. I'm wary of anything that tries to be too profit-oriented. I don't know if that answers all of the questions.
Adina?
Sure. Thank you for this question. I think I'm going to pick up on one of your provocations on solutions as well. And so as a political scientist and as a participatory action researcher, my interest is this question of power. And to build on Charlotte's point, the power of voice. Who gets to be in a room, who gets to shape the conversation? And so if I circle back to the example of Egypt, and as preparing for this panel, I did a quick search to see what the scholarship, the literature, has produced on Egypt. And because part of this question on scholarship is what translates into policy rooms, what gets picked up, what are the citational practices of knowledge production that get picked up by the UNs of the world, the World Food Programs of the world, the WTOs of the world, and so on. And despite that we have seen a surge in the debt picture in Egypt, the number of academic publications that have been produced exploring the impact on women, exploring the impact on food security, are numbered on two hands, right? And we're talking about a very slim base here. And so there's also a loop, a knowledge loop. What kind of knowledge are we funding? What kind of research methodologies are we supporting? What kind of questions are we asking? And part of the issue of solutions is what kind of questions are we asking to break out of these silos? So, we saw there's some very important research from the Egyptian Economic Research Forum, for instance, that's looking at the relationship between food security and intimate partner violence. There's work there that exists. We saw that there is some work on credit and access to microloans that also sees the relationship and the disproportionate impact on women. But I think and I say this kind of building a little bit on Charlotte's point, and this is from a much long time ago in my career. I worked on a project on value chain integration. And as someone who is sort of supporting the stakeholder consultation design of participatory models of how we bring farmers into a room, I used to find it remarkable that half of those rooms were filled with men. The majority of those rooms were filled with women, where I would often be the only female, often the youngest female, and there's a sort of perception of who gets to speak to the agroeconomists, the technical specialists, coming in to think of their supply chains and integration into global export markets. So I think there's an element of how do we also ask different questions, and ask those questions paying attention to power. And I would start from that premise, because I think with the private sector story in Egyptian context across much of North Africa, there's multiple stories of power there at different scales.
And to pick up on your point, I think it was Virginia Woolf who famously said, are we asking the right question? And I think really that is always the good starting point. Was there another person in the audience who wanted to come in here? So we're running... we got the mic. Great. Unless you want to shout.
I can try shouting. Or I'll wait for the mic. Thank you. I'm Emma Dutton. I'm a development economist at FCDO. I'm in the Sustainable Food Systems team. I just had a brief question for Reem. I was wondering if you could just speak to the small-scale mining for women issue. Obviously, there's been a lot of issues in the DRC with kind of artisanal mining and child mining, and lack of regulation. And I was just wondering if you see this being a more prevalent issue, particularly with kind of lack of legal rights for women, if there's any kind of safety concerns surrounding this issue.
Do you feel it was really wanted to comment on mining is in conflict areas?
Thank you for this question, but before I go to this, I wanted to have 2 comments on your question. It's the role of philanthropic organizations rather than the private sector. I think this is also an important aspect because they go on the ground sometimes and then they make a local impact. And the second one, on the market issue, it's very important to encourage women to have collectives, like cooperatives, to create markets. So markets, they don't just create by themselves. You have to have the structures, the systems for them to be created. So if we say, from where we start, the cash transfers or market, so we need to develop the market. So the market, they are not developed by themselves. So this is, I wanted to make those points. So on the mining, yes, obviously, especially the small scale mining, we need, in fact, we need to take good cases and build on them. Of course, this child labor, all the policies that are really against human rights, child right and women right, they have to be really very carefully enforced and giving the rights. But then the idea is to allow the use of those mining, small-scale mining, for a specific population. For example, let's assume a community in a certain area, and then connect with universities. So then you develop a concept of sustainable mining for livelihood and then transfer. So there is a transition to agriculture type of activities, because you cannot mine forever. You can mine, for example, for a certain period of time, and then you create what I call saving schemes that will allow you to invest them with the appropriate structures to develop agriculture type of projects. And then you have the capital for it. So you really create a kind of a savings scheme to develop the agriculture activities. But then at the same time, you need to be connected to universities, and this is the role of the government or philanthropic organizations, which they can really promote this type of local solutions, and then not to just focus on, who is going to, of course, we need to be, at least we have to have cases which work. And how do they work? We need to develop pilots. And how these pilots work, they have to be very carefully monitored with social workers or for academics and policy people who are also eventually they can do something in that sense. So really it has to be organized, coordinated to be able to have a difference. Otherwise we go into schemes that we can see them very much in Africa, led by the Chinese. You have child labor, you have unpaid workers, you have machines that are not extracting in the appropriate manner, and then you have unsustainable mining using mercury, and then it's killing the arable land, not allowing the arable land, in fact the land to produce later on, so it's killed. Practically all this will only foster what I call the destructive dynamics and the perversive effect of poverty. So this is what it does, because then you have to move to another mining, you have to work with other providers and other license holders, and this really creates the vicious circle. This is very easy to be to go into that direction. But if you don't have the appropriate regulatory and supervisory tools there on the ground, it's very difficult to make it.
Okay, so I am very aware of the time that we've gone over, and you're probably all sitting there, and thinking, lunch break, well, some of us are. So I am going to bring it to a close, but I think you're all going to be around during the lunch break, so perhaps you could...
We can take...
You sure? Okay, all right. So is that okay if I maybe bring in one more?
Hello, good afternoon, everyone. Again, happy International Women's Day to all the women in the room, but also to the male allies, right? Can we give them applause, yeah? Really happy to see the male presence here. Something that, my name is Suad Mohammed. I am here, I'm part of FLIA here at LSE. I'm also a strategic advisor to governments and organizations, UK, MENA, and Africa, on leadership development. Something that Dina have said really resonated with me about being the only woman in the room. I have served in so many boards in academia and outside academia, and I am usually, would like to think the young woman, but not sure about young, but I'm certainly the only woman in the room. So my question to you here is, in your experience, given your experience, what do you think organizations, what practical steps can they take, organizations, whether private or public, to truly, move beyond the rhetoric and embed gender equity in leadership structures, especially in conflict-affected and post-conflict regions, where food security is most fragile and where women are at the forefront of food production and economic resilience? And it can be to any of you, really. Thank you.
That's a big question. Would any of you like to take it?
I can, maybe digressing slightly.
I think we should have broken for lunch because it's going to take a while.
It's a really, really important question. So thank you for raising it. I think, I was involved a while ago with an organisation, Global Health 50/50, which kind of monitors exactly these issues, like who's in the room, what are the networks of connection that allow those specific people to be in the room, whether it's, they went to the same university or they studied together at some point along the way or whatever it is. And again, power is the central question, right? I think people, finding allies. I appreciate the men that are in the room, but fundamentally there's not that many. I think just really showing people, whether by statistics or whatever is going to convince them that this benefits everyone, right? We get better solutions, we get more integrated conversations, we get different perspectives when there is a more diverse representation in the positions of power, right? And I think for anyone who is ever in a position of power, I just really want to celebrate whenever you've helped someone platform their voice, and just encourage people to really do that much more, because it's really, really important. And I think even from personal experience, and I wouldn't, I'm not vulnerable in any way, I still appreciate it when someone encourages me or gives me the opportunity to kind of speak out in a way that I wouldn't normally. And so I just think if everyone kind of does that, there's that kind of pay it forward dimension that plays in there, which is also a great representation of everyone who's here today, right? There's kind of that solidarity element.
Dina?
I can say something very quick on this, and won't be a bit the holder between us and lunch. But first of all, this was talking about an experience nearly 14 years ago, so it reminds me of my own age. But what I will say is two things. One is to build on Charlotte's point, that I got into a lot of trouble once because I decided to invite a woman, where it was sort of like a village consultation, and the women that were serving the tea, I decided to bring them into the conversation. I got in a lot of trouble for this, right? That it was not respecting cultural customs, and that I should have, the village head was very upset with me, and things of the sort. But there is an element of how do women who are in these spaces bring others into it. But there's also an element of being aware and hyper-cognizant of shadow spaces of power and alternative spaces of power. That just because they're not in a room doesn't mean they aren't in other rooms. And I think part of the exercise, and maybe to reference what Imogen was talking about in her research, part of the exercise here is also how do we create those bridges? How do we have a research lens, a policy lens, a practice lens that actually seeks to examine the different types of rooms and the different spheres of power and how those two can come together. Just because they're not there doesn't mean they're not decision makers in some sphere. And I think part of the exercise for us is to really ask the questions about what alternative decision making spheres in practice, in everyday lived realities exist.
Okay, well, I am rather going to bring it to a close, because I think this conversation is going to stretch over lunch, because there'll be loads of people, including me, who will come back to you and go, well, that was such a great point, but there is always the but. So will you join me in thanking our panel of speakers? Wishing you all a fantastic Women's Day for the rest of the day. Thank you.
And we thank you for a great moderation.